Towards the end of the Middle Ages, starting around the 12th century or so, we see a rise of cathedral schools and then universities. The first universities are born during the Middle Ages. Some of the earliest ones are the University of Bologna and the University of Paris. And these cathedral schools that arose in the 12th century and then later universities gave the opportunity for brilliant thinkers like Peter Abelard to gather students and to teach for a living. The earliest universities weren't based in a particular city. They didn't have great buildings and so forth. The earliest universities actually were organizations of students. They would get together and form sort of a union, a students' union, and they would hire teachers, and then they would enforce strict policies on the teachers. They wanted to be taught so that they could go on and become teachers themselves. Well, not to be undone, the professors formed their own unions, and they formed professors' unions. And anyways, this gave rise to the earliest universities. So Abelard, in the 12th century, wrote a book called, in Latin, Sic et Non, which in English is yes and no. And what he did was he collected the writings of earlier church fathers and who talked about various topics. He organized them according to topic. And sometimes they would say one thing on a topic and others would say seemingly the opposite thing. And so what Abelard did was he had his students read these seemingly contradictory statements and then debate them to see if they could come up with a solution to how to reconcile these different statements. And this gave rise to a way of teaching, a way of learning known as scholasticism. The greatest of the scholastics, I should say about Abelard, he's more famous today probably for his love affair with Heloise, one of his students, which was a big no-no back then, just as it is now. If you want to look up the story of Abelard and Heloise, just look it up on Wikipedia or something. It's a very interesting and somewhat tragic story, but I'm not going to spend any more time on it. The greatest of the scholastic teachers was a guy by the name of Thomas Aquinas, and he taught at the University of Paris in the Faculty of Theology. And he took the scholastic method of Abelard and others of his predecessors and developed it even further. He wrote his greatest work called Summa Theologica about the year 1274, and it's a very large book, and it was used in universities, theology universities, for years. And what he does is he presents arguments on one side of a theological issue, then arguments on the other side. He quotes people. He gives supporting statements and then opposing statements, and then he tells you what his conclusion is at the end. And he probably, like Abelard, used the questions and the propositions in the book as fodder for his students to debate the issues so they could learn to think clearly about some of the issues that they were studying. So this is, and in fact, this same method is used to a lesser degree in modern debate clubs. So you have statement, counter-statement, arguments in favor, arguments against, evidence, pro and con, that sort of thing still exists today in debate clubs. All right. Well, in the year 1453, the Byzantine Empire had been getting slowly weaker and weaker and weaker over the centuries, and by the year 1453, there was very little left of the so-called Byzantine Empire other than the city of Constantinople. And so one of the leaders of the Ottoman Turks sailed into the city and attacked it, got beyond the walls in the Great Horn, it's called, and he captured the city of Constantinople and made Constantinople, changed the name of the city to Istanbul, which is really just a Turkish form of Constantinople. If you listen, the two names sound pretty similar. Anyways, Istanbul became the capital of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire lasted for another 500 years almost, 450. It was dissolved only after World War I. So, but this is considered by many scholars to be the end of the Middle Ages, the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. Another important factor in the ending the Middle Ages was the invention of the printing press around the year 1450, so about the same time. Johannes Gutenberg was the first one in the West to use movable type and put it in big machines. And the idea of movable type was that if you wanted to print a book, you could just reuse the same letters over and over again, and you could set the letters in type, and then you had a big press, and you'd ink the letters, and then you put the paper in there, and you put the press down and come up, and you'd have a big sheet of paper, and it was a huge sheet of paper. It wasn't just like one page; it was like 32 pages that would then need to be folded and cut, and then sewn together into a book. But you could do this over and over and over again, and all of a sudden you have a way to mass produce information. And so the printing press was quickly adopted. Some of the first books ever printed were religious texts. There were the Gutenberg Bible was a Latin Bible that was printed very early on. Hebrew Bibles were printed by rabbis before the year 1500. Interestingly, the Greek New Testament was not printed until the year 1516. So some 66 years, more or less, after the invention of Gutenberg's printing press. And there's a story behind why it wasn't, why the Greek New Testament didn't come out till then. However, it's probably no coincidence that shortly, a year after the Greek New Testament was printed, the Protestant Reformation began in the year 1517. Protestant Reformation is associated mostly with a monk, former Augustinian monk, by the name of Martin Luther. Now, Luther was a professor at the University of Wittenberg, and he was an Augustinian monk, so he was Catholic. And he, on October 31st, 1517, he had become dissatisfied with some of the teachings of the church, and he wanted to have a debate on some of these issues. In particular, he was upset about the policy, the practice of issuing indulgences. An indulgence was like a forgiveness. The idea had developed among Catholics that not only, we talked about differentiated afterlife, heaven and hell, but not only was there heaven and hell, there was also kind of an intermediate state called purgatory. And people who were ultimately destined for heaven, but weren't saints, weren't good enough to go straight to heaven, they would end up in purgatory. And the idea behind an indulgence was if you had a loved one, a father, a sister, a son, whatever, who was in purgatory, you could buy an indulgence and say a prayer, and the priest or the pope would say a prayer because of the indulgence, and the indulgence would knock off, 10 years or 100 years or whatever from that person's stay in purgatory. Well, Martin Luther thought that this was just gross. He said, if the Pope had the power to knock years off people's stay in purgatory, out of mercy, he ought to just let everybody out of purgatory and send them all to heaven. So he wanted to have a debate on this. And so on October 31st, 1517, he nailed to the door of the church in Wittenberg something that came to be known as the 95 Theses. These were the 95 points that Luther wanted to debate. Well, one thing led to another, and before too long, they were calling for Luther's head for proposing these things. For one thing, indulgences were being used to build the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, and, they couldn't build it without the donations from Christians around the western part of the empire, well, the Western world. And so they were very much opposed to Luther. He was hitting them in the pocketbook. And so they tried to trick Luther into coming to a conference, and they were going to arrest him and imprison him and perhaps execute him. They'd done this to some of Luther's predecessors. But Luther had wised up. He was smart, and he made an appearance at the conference, the Diet of Worms it was called, because it was held in the city of Worms. He made his statement, and then he escaped and before they could arrest him, and he hid out in the castle at a place called Wartburg, and he translated the Bible, the New Testament anyways, into German from Greek. And so this led to a number of reforms within the church, and eventually this church that was calling for reform broke from the Catholic Church, and they became Protestants, that is, protesters against the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Lutheran Church was born, and Luther left Wartburg after a couple of years, returned to Wittenberg, and which was in the the state of Saxony, and he was protected by the leader of Saxony, whose name was Frederick the Wise. And because of the printing press, they were able to get their ideas spread around, and also because of the printing press, literacy rates were rising around Europe. And so many people started to read, or at least hear, the ideas of these Protestant reformers, like Luther, like Zwingli in Switzerland, like John Calvin in Geneva, also in Switzerland. Zwingli was in Zurich. And so these ideas kind of spread throughout much of Northern Europe at first. John Calvin established a slightly different form of Protestantism in Geneva, became known as Reformed Protestantism. The distinctions don't need to detain us here. Calvin put more emphasis on predestination than Luther did. He also had a slightly different understanding of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, in the host, in the bread of communion. Luther accepted more or less the Catholic view that the real body and blood of Christ was in the bread and the wine. And for Calvin, it was more symbolic. It was only spiritually present. Well, these two branches of Protestantism, the Lutheran and the Reformed, were joined soon by the Anglican branch. It turns out that Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife, Catherine of Aragon, because she hadn't given him a son. And so he wanted to divorce her. The Catholic Church said, no, you can't divorce her, mainly not because divorce was unheard of. It happened all the time, actually. But because Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of the powerful king of Spain, and he was a powerful supporter of the Pope, so there are a lot of politics involved. Well, so Henry VIII said, well, in that case, I declare myself leader of the church, and because, he'd heard of Luther, and Calvin was around the same time too. And so he formed a new branch of the church, the Anglican branch of the church. And so now you have the Lutherans, you have the Calvinists, or Reformed, and you have the Anglicans. And before too long, there are all sorts of other groups as well. You have the Baptists, you have the Methodists, you have the Disciples of Christ. Later on, you get the Pentecostals. You get all sorts of different groups. And then these individual groups would split and split and split. And so today you have, I couldn't even tell you, innumerable different Protestant groups. They tend to be grouped into fairly large traditions. And now there's a tradition of coming back together. So, for example, in the 1960s, various split up Methodist church came back together to form the United Methodist Church. They joined denominations. But then there are still splits in denominations as well. So these are the Protestant churches. What about the Catholic Church? What was going on with the Catholic Church? Well, they had what was called, Protestants called it the Counter-Reformation because it was opposed to the Reformation. Catholics often called it the Catholic Reformation. At any rate, they reacted to the Protestant Reformation in various ways. They reformed the papacy in some ways. They established finally and officially the canon of Scripture, even though it had been agreed upon for several centuries by this time, really for over 1,000 years. By this time, it hadn't ever been officially designated as, which books were in the canon and which were not. So they were declared by the Council of Trent, the canon of Scripture was. And the Council of Trent was in the 16th century, between 1545 and 1563. And in particular, the Catholics in the Old Testament included books that Protestants call the Apocrypha. So books like 1st and 2nd Maccabees, additions to Esther, Judith, Tobit, other books like that, Ecclesiasticus. These are books that are in the Catholic Bible, but are not in Protestant Bibles. So that's why there are some differences among the canons of the different groups. And then the Eastern Orthodox canon is pretty close to the same as the Catholic canon with a couple of minor differences. At any rate, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, continued to make reforms. And so in the 19th century, they held a council, ecumenical council, called Vatican I, the First Vatican Council, from 1869 to 1870. One of the most important things to come out of that council was the declaration of papal infallibility, the idea that when the Pope spoke ex cathedra, that is, when he gave an official pronouncement, he could never be wrong. Well, if you look at the history of the papacy, that seems a little far-fetched because there have been lots of popes who have disagreed with one another. But nevertheless, this was a very strong statement of the authority of the popes, and it is official Catholic doctrine to this day. The Second Vatican Council in 1962 to 1965 took a very different tack. Vatican II reached out to other Christians and even people of other faiths, acknowledging their sincerity of belief, the fact that they possess some elements of the truth in their beliefs. It didn't say, and it kind of backed off from the statement that salvation is only within the Roman Catholic Church. Vatican II, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, because this is 20 years later, also explicitly condemned anti-Semitism, which was welcome to many Christian groups, and certainly to the Jews as well. And also, equally important, Vatican II allowed Catholic churches to offer the Mass in the vernacular languages. To this point, Mass had been offered only in Latin, for the most part, within Roman Catholic churches. And now it can be offered in English and Spanish and Italian and Swahili and whatever other language people happen to speak. And so this was a major change within the Roman Catholic Church. Now, within Protestant Christianity, Protestant Christians continue to develop. They went in a variety of different ways. You have classical liberalism that developed in the 19th century, but you also have neo-orthodoxy, which was a swing back in the direction of orthodoxy. And then on the other extreme, you have fundamentalism, which the name comes from a series of pamphlets called The Fundamentals that were published in the early 20th century. And fundamentalism rejected all forms of modernism and proclaimed the infallibility of the Bible. So this is one group of Christians, and then there are groups that believe wildly different things. Pentecostalism, the movement that became known as Pentecostalism, started with the Azusa Street Revival in 1906 in San Francisco, and in particular, the practice of speaking in tongues, speaking in what's called glossolalia, tongues, unknown tongues that are supposed to be languages of the Holy Spirit, language that only God can understand, or other Christians who have the gift. And so Pentecostalism became a growing movement. It's a large movement today among Protestants. And there are also charismatic Catholics, for that matter, who have been influenced by the Pentecostal movement. More recently, in the later 20th century, let's say after World War II and into the 21st century, many Protestant churches have become more inclusive of women and the LGBTQ community, including female and gay priests and bishops in some denominations, not all, obviously. And you don't see any female priests in the Catholic Church or the Orthodox churches yet. But in many Protestant, not all, but many Protestant denominations, you do see female priests and deacons and other leaders, and sometimes bishops as well. Some groups continue to reject both female clergy and gay and lesbian clergy. Most evangelical Christians reject female clergy and gay clergy, although that's not across the board. There is some encroachment at the edges there, and who knows what will happen in future years. The last thing I want to mention about Christianity, relatively recent developments since World War II, is the development of the ecumenical movement. This was a movement among Protestants, beginning with Protestants anyways, to find common belief and practices. In other words, they said, look, there's all these different Protestant denominations, and that's fine, but what do we have in common? We want to emphasize what we have in common rather than our differences. And so they got together and started the ecumenical movement in 1948. It was the group was called the World Council of Churches. It's still around today. And most Protestant groups, mainstream Protestant groups anyways, joined the World Council of Churches. Some Orthodox groups, Eastern Orthodox, joined the World Council of Churches. The Roman Catholic Church didn't join the World Council of Churches. For one thing, it would have overwhelmed it because it's so much bigger but the Roman Catholic Church has observer status in World Council of Churches meetings. And then there are important groups that have not joined the ecumenical movement. In particular, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest Protestant group in the United States, has explicitly rejected the need for to join ecumenical groups like the National Council of Churches or the World Council of Churches, although they do engage in dialogue, one-on-one dialogue, for example, with the Roman Catholic Church. All right, well, I think that's all I want to say about Christianity. I have posted some questions to the discussion board. You can continue responding to the questions on Judaism through Friday at midnight. And then after you watch these videos, go ahead and start answering questions on Christianity as well.